December 16th, 1944. Before dawn, in a snowy Belgian forest that American commanders had treated as a quiet, thinly held sector, artillery suddenly lights up the tree line. Radio nets crackle with half-heard reports. German voices, tanks in the dark, units cut off. By nightfall, more than 400,000 German troops are driving a wedge into the Allied front. Over the next 6 weeks, about 19,000 Americans will be killed, around 47,000 wounded, and more than 23,000 captured or missing in what becomes the largest and bloodiest battle the United States Army fights in the entire war, the Battle of the Bulge. 3 weeks earlier, Jacob Devers, the American general in charge of 6th Army Group, was standing on the west bank of the Rhine near Strasbourg. Patrols had found parts of the German bunkers across the river empty, and his engineers already had assault boats and bridging gear moving into position. Devers asked Allied High Command for permission to cross into Germany before Christmas. The answer was no. In the judgment of his own senior officers, and later of the official United States Army historians who studied the campaign, that refusal threw away a real chance to hit Germany across the Rhine first, a move that could have prevented the Battle of the Bulge before it began. Jacob Devers did not come out of nowhere. He came out of the same professional circle as the other future senior generals, but never quite became part of the inner group in the way some of them did. He graduated from West Point in the class of 1909, the same year as George Patton, but his path did not follow the cavalry officer who became famous with the public. Contemporaries described Devers as a meticulous artilleryman, a teetotaler, a planner and organizer rather than a showman. As war returned to Europe, General George Marshall looked for officers who could help build a modern army almost from scratch. In 1940, Devers was promoted over many other colonels to brigadier general and then to major general, making him one of the younger officers of that rank in the land forces. Marshall then gave him one of the important jobs in the United States Army, serving as chief of the armored force at Fort Knox. From that post, Devers did not sit with a slide rule designing tanks himself, but he shaped the decisions that would put American armor on European battlefields. He pushed hard for the M4 Sherman to go into mass production and kept pressing for heavier, better-armed tanks, including what would become the M26 Pershing, and he backed an ungainly amphibious truck, the DUKW, against skeptics who thought it was a gimmick. Devers was not the engineer in the factory. He was the senior officer who fought bureaucratic and doctrinal battles so that those machines actually existed in numbers when the fighting started. The kind of work that rarely makes headlines but can decide campaigns. In 1943, after Lieutenant General Frank Andrews was killed in a plane crash while commanding the European Theater of Operations United States Army, Devers took over that post. By that time, Eisenhower was already in the Mediterranean, running the North African campaign. On paper, it looked as if the quiet Pennsylvanian had replaced Eisenhower in London, but once Eisenhower returned as Supreme Allied Commander in Northwest Europe, Devers again became subordinate to him. That appointment still marked him as one of the officers Marshall considered capable of command at the highest level. And that judgment mattered later when questions of trust and strategy came together at a hotel in eastern France. If you were sitting in London in the summer of 1944, most attention was on Normandy and the slow, grinding push out of the bocage. But Devers' main test would come somewhere else. On August 15th, 1944, Allied troops landed in southern France in Operation Dragoon, a landing that Winston Churchill had strongly opposed. The British Prime Minister argued for continuing operations through Italy and toward the Balkans, and saw a landing on the Riviera as a diversion of precious shipping and troops. American planners around Marshall saw something different, a way to open new ports, cut German lines of retreat, and bring French forces back onto their own soil in strength, while Charles de Gaulle wanted a French army to return by the Mediterranean to reinforce the political legitimacy of Free France. In practical terms, Dragoon fell under Devers' 6th Army Group, which controlled the United States 7th Army and the French 1st Army, as they pushed inland against relatively light and disorganized German resistance. Marseille and Toulon fell before the end of August and were rapidly turned into major supply ports, and by October, more than 500,000 tons of cargo were moving north through southern France, easing the strain on the Normandy supply line. The German 19th Army retreated up the Rhone Valley in poor shape, and some historians describe it as virtually destroyed as a coherent force. Casualties in Dragoon were much lower than in Overlord. The advance was faster, and more French territory was liberated in a matter of weeks than many officers had expected to see in months, but reporters and newsreel cameras stayed mostly with Montgomery and Bradley in the north. Later writers have argued that the very success and relative smoothness of Dragoon helped it fade into the background as a forgotten victory. For David personally, it had another consequence. He now commanded an army group that included what was then the largest French land force ever placed under foreign command, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny's First Army. That meant he was no longer dealing only with American corps, he also had to take account of de Gaulle's political aims, and nowhere was that more sensitive than in Alsace. In November 1944, as Eisenhower's armies pushed toward the German border, Alsace and the city of Strasbourg were more than just points on a map. Strasbourg had been annexed by Germany in 1940, and for many French people, its cathedral was remembered as a symbol of defeat going back to the Franco-Prussian War, while de Gaulle had publicly stated that French colours would fly again from its spire. Devers' 6th Army Group, advancing through the Vosges Mountains, helped deliver that moment. On November 23, 1944, French armour from General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division, supported by American units of 15th Corps, entered Strasbourg and raised the tricolour over the cathedral that afternoon. For Paris and for de Gaulle, this was a political triumph. And for Devers, it was also a clear operational success. Since his Southern Army Group had broken through difficult terrain, seized a major city, and pushed the German 19th Army back toward the Rhine. At the same time, patrols moved east beyond the built-up areas and down to the river. Along parts of the Siegfried Line opposite Strasbourg, they reported something that, veterans later recalled, surprised experienced officers. Some of the bunkers on the far bank were unoccupied. By late November, Devers' forward units, including French armoured formations, had reached the west bank of the Rhine, near Strasbourg and further south. Engineer officers, such as Brigadier General Garrison H. Davidson, serving as 7th Army's chief engineer, had been planning for the possibility of a crossing. DUKWs were being brought forward, and bridging equipment was being staged. On the maps at Supreme Headquarters, the Rhine appeared as a heavy blue obstacle in front of thick symbols for German defences, and intelligence estimates still suggested that a major assault would run into strong, prepared positions backed by reserves. On the ground, Devers' patrols were seeing something different. They crossed the river in small boats, examined concrete casemates and rows of dragon's teeth opposite their sector, and in some places found them deserted. Prisoners and local civilians told Devers' staff that units had been pulled away to reinforce the main front farther north. Devers concluded that the German 19th Army facing him had taken heavy losses, and that German commanders were reallocating strength away from his sector. Behind him, he had an intact rail line, and the expanding ports opened by Operation Dragoon. The river here was relatively narrow, compared with stretches farther north, and although the weather was deteriorating, ice had not yet become a serious obstacle. From an engineer's point of view, this did not make a crossing easy, but Davidson and others later said it looked feasible. Pontoon bridges could be thrown across under cover of artillery and smoke, DUKWs and assault boats could carry initial waves, and once a bridgehead was dug in, armour could move. Over. For a commander who had just overseen an amphibious landing in southern France and the rapid inland advance that followed, a river assault with prepared engineer units and a thinly held opposite bank did not seem reckless. It looked like the next logical step. In Davis's planning, a crossing in late November would not have been a direct drive on Berlin. It would have been aimed at securing a foothold on the east bank, and then moving north along the Rhine towards cities such as Mainz and Frankfurt to threaten the rear of German forces opposing Bradley and Patton. The difficulty for Devers was that by November 1944, he did not control the overall design of the campaign. Eisenhower did. Eisenhower had committed himself to a different concept, the broad front. From Eisenhower's perspective, the main effort had to remain in the north. The Ruhr, not the Upper Rhine, was the industrial centre he wanted to break. The ports feeding the Allied armies, especially Antwerp, were tied into the northern axis. British forces were heavily engaged there, and Churchill pushed for resources to support Montgomery's advance. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, debated then and later, aimed to keep pressure along the whole line while slowly concentrating enough strength for decisive blows to stretch German forces, wear them down, and avoid one deep thrust that might outrun its supplies and be cut off. Within that framework, the Southern Army Group had a clear but secondary role: to protect the flank, clear German forces west of the Rhine in Alsace and Lorraine, and hold the Strasbourg area. A crossing of the Rhine in the south before the main northern armies were ready looked to Eisenhower's planners like a move that might create a salient that would be hard to supply and defend. Devers argued that his logistical position, built on Marseille and the rail network from southern France, was stronger than Eisenhower's staff believed, while that staff judged those lines still too fragile to sustain a major drive deep into Germany from the Upper Rhine. Coalition politics added another layer. De Gaulle and General de Lattre wanted French troops in the lead for the liberation of Alsace and then to move east into Germany. And de Gaulle also insisted on influence over how far French formations went onto German soil and under whose command they served. Churchill remained wary of committing large resources in the south, and Eisenhower had to take these views into account. From the map tables at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, a bold southern river crossing could therefore look like a high-risk gamble that might not help the main push toward the Ruhr. On the night of November 24, 1944, those differing assessments met face-to-face. The meeting took place at the Hotel Heritage in Vittel, a spa town in eastern France that served as Devers' Army Group headquarters. Eisenhower and Omar Bradley arrived on November 24, 1944, to inspect the Southern Front, visited Corps headquarters during the day, and then returned to Devers' command post for dinner, where George Patton, whose Third Army was driving through Lorraine, joined them. After the meal, the four officers, the Supreme Commander, two Army Group commanders, and one Army commander, sat down to decide what to do next. Devers set out his argument. 7th Army and the French First Army had reached the Rhine. Patrols had checked fortifications opposite their sector, and in some places found them unoccupied. The German 19th Army had been driven back and was in poor condition, and his engineers, with DUKWs and bridging units already moving forward, believed a crossing was still possible before winter weather closed in. From his point of view, the principle was to build on success. His front was moving while Bradley's forces in the north were fighting costly battles such as the Hürtgen Forest for limited gains, so he questioned why they should not exploit the one sector where German defenses seemed to have thinned. Bradley argued against shifting the main effort. Intelligence still showed strong German formations east of the Rhine and a dense defensive system, and he warned that even if the first elements got over with little opposition, any bridgehead would be exposed to counterattack, with the Rhine still a major obstacle. Committing scarce bridging and armored resources to the south, he felt, would weaken operations in the central and northern sectors. Eisenhower listened and then supported Bradley's view. His priority remained to concentrate power where he expected the decisive breakthrough, in the center and north. And in that context, every division, every bridging unit, and every load of fuel sent to Devers would not be available to Patton or to the 1st and 9th Armies farther north. For Devers and his staff, the conversation was very concrete. His engineers had already measured river widths, current, and bank conditions, and Davidson's people had drawn up draft plans for crossings near Strasbourg and at other points, so when orders came from above to stop, some officers later said it felt as if higher headquarters was ignoring what they were seeing on the ground. Accounts agree that the discussion lasted late into the night. Later, the official United States Army history that covered Devers Theater judged Eisenhower's refusal to authorize the crossing as hard to understand in retrospect. The outcome, however, was unambiguous. Devers was told to halt preparations for any assault over the Rhine. Instead, 6th Army Group was instructed to concentrate on eliminating the Colmar Pocket, the German bridgehead west of the river, south of Strasbourg, and on sending some forces north to support Patton in the Saar. In his diary, Devers noted his disappointment and his feeling of being isolated inside the Allied command structure, and years later, officers who had served on his staff still described that night in bitter terms. Even so, those same retrospective accounts do not portray Eisenhower as acting out of personal hostility. They point out that he was balancing logistics, coalition politics, and the risk of overextending his front. So the dispute at Vittel appears in the record as a clash between different strategic views rather than a simple personal quarrel. In the weeks after the Vittel meeting, the character of operations on Diva's front changed. Rather than pushing straight on toward the Rhine and beyond, 7th Army and the French 1st Army were ordered to put their main effort against the Colmar pocket. That bulge of German held territory west of the Rhine, which contained parts of several divisions, tied down Allied formations and threatened the flank if it remained, and clearing. It turned into a hard winter battle in difficult country. The pocket was not finally reduced until February 5, 1945, and the fighting cost French and American units heavily. At the same time, Diva's line became thin. When Hitler launched Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front against Alsace and Lorraine at the end of December, the main weight fell on 6th Army Group. 7th Army, stretched over a long front with limited reserves, took serious blows, but managed to keep Strasbourg in Allied hands, helped by de Gaulle and de Lattre, who refused to agree to any plan that would give up the city. Allied analysts later argued that the weeks after Vittel gave German commanders more freedom of action in the south, since Army Group G and the remnants of 19th Army no longer faced a realistic chance of an early river crossing in the Strasbourg sector and could be drawn on for other needs. Even so, their attention was not directed only to Nordwind. Long before Divas reached the Rhine, Hitler and the German High Command had been planning a large offensive in the Ardennes, with the aim of punching through what they believed was a quiet section of the American line, crossing the Meuse, and taking Antwerp in order to separate British and American forces. To support that plan, they had to gather fuel, artillery, and above all divisions, especially armored units, and those formations had to be pulled out of other parts of the front. On December 16, 1944, the German attack in the Ardennes opened across a front of roughly 50 miles. The American units in that sector were a mix of battle-weary divisions sent there to rest and inexperienced or rebuilding formations still learning winter warfare. They were thin on the ground, short of armor, and did not expect a major assault. The German side had concentrated several panzer divisions, including some of the best-known formations in 6th Panzer Army, together with Volksgrenadier, infantry divisions that included experienced cadres. The effect was immediate. Some American units were overrun or surrounded, and towns such as St. Vith and the road junction at Bastogne became key defensive positions. The 101st Airborne Division, sent into Bastogne with very little time to prepare, soon found itself encircled in snow and fog while holding the road network that the German advance needed to secure. Over about 6 weeks, the United States Army stopped the offensive and then forced the Germans back to their starting line. But the cost was very high, around 81,000 American casualties, of whom about 19,000 were killed, which is why the Battle of the Bulge is generally described as the single bloodiest battle in United States Army history. For officers who had seen Davis engineers roll up their bridging plans after the Vittel meeting, it was natural to ask afterwards whether events in Alsace 3 weeks before the Ardennes attack might have altered what happened in that winter offensive. At this point, the story moves into the realm of what might have happened rather than what did. People who were there kept thinking about that missed crossing for years. Brigadier General Garrison H. Davidson, Diva's chief engineer, later tried to put into words what he thought had been lost. Writing decades afterward, he argued that if 6th Army Group had forced the Rhine near Strasbourg in late November and then pushed quickly up the east bank, Hitler might have been compelled to throw his carefully assembled reserves into defending the German interior instead of committing them to the Ardennes. And he went so far as to say that such a success might have removed any real chance for the Battle of the Bulge and might have saved tens of thousands of lives while shortening the war by months. Other senior officers shared that sense that an opportunity had been missed, and Patton noted in his diary that he regarded the decision not to back Divas as a mistake, while General Alexander, Patch of 7th Army, expressed similar views. Modern historians tend to be more guarded. The official United States Army History Riviera to the Rhine includes a section that labels Eisenhower's choice over Divas' proposal as a dubious decision, and comments that his refusal to let Divas exploit unexpectedly weak defenses along the Rhine is hard to explain in hindsight. And the authors point out that a strong advance up the east bank at that moment might have forced the German High Command to commit reserves earlier than planned before the Ardennes attack. The same study, however, does not claim that the Battle of the Bulge would simply have disappeared. By late November, the German plan for the Ardennes was already well developed. Some of the panzer formations earmarked for it were based far from Davis's sector, and problems of fuel, weather, and Hitler's own insistence on the offensive all affected the timing. Put simply, a successful Divas crossing might have disrupted the Ardennes operation, or it might only have changed its scale and schedule. It is reasonable to say that such a move could have blunted or complicated the Bulge, but it is not possible to say honestly that we know it would have prevented it. What is not in dispute is that the Vittel decision removed a real potential threat from the German southern flank. At the same time, German leaders were gathering scarce forces for what would be their last major offensive in the West. After the war, that meeting at Vittel took on a second life in the way the story of the campaign was told. Devers continued to command in the field. 6th Army Group fought off Operation Nordwind, finished reducing the Colmar pocket, and then crossed the Rhine in March 1945, when overall strategy and supply now supported crossings along most of the front. Units under Devers went on to help take cities such as Stuttgart, Nuremberg, and Munich, and parts of his command were involved in the liberation of Dachau and the advance into Western Austria and the Berchtesgaden area. On March 8, 1945, Marshall, over Eisenhower's objections, had Devers promoted to full general, and 4 days later, Omar Bradley received the same promotion, a sequence that some contemporaries and later historians have taken as a sign of Marshall's regard for Devers. In the post-war years, Eisenhower published Crusade in Europe. Bradley wrote A Soldier's Story. Patton's diaries and image after his death shaped how many readers saw the war, and Montgomery and de Gaulle produced their own accounts. Devers appears in these narratives, but not often as a central figure, and the Vittel meeting in particular is treated briefly or without much detail in several of the best-known personal memoirs. Riviera to the Rhine, which is not a personal memoir but a research-based operational study, gives a fuller account, including the planned crossing, the reconnaissance reports about empty positions, the arguments at Vittel, the order that followed, and Davidson's later criticism in a note. That difference illustrates how wartime decisions can enter public memory, because when the commanders who made the choices also write the most widely read books, some episodes receive less emphasis than others. Devers himself did not mount a public campaign to clear his name. He returned to senior staff work, later served as chairman of the American Battle Monuments Commission, and died in 1979. It was only later that a group of historians looked more closely at 6th Army Group, Operation Dragoon, and the late November chants at the Rhine, and works such as David Colley's Decision at Strasbourg and Studies of Alsace and the Southern Front argue that Devers' record has been underrated, and that Eisenhower's decision at Vittel deserves closer examination. Even those writers usually present the episode as a contest between caution and aggressiveness, and between bureaucratic habits and battlefield impressions, rather than as a simple story of heroes on one side and villains on the other. So, where does that leave Jacob Devers and the idea that he almost stopped the Battle of the Bulge? If you pull the record together, there are a few things you can say with reasonable confidence. In November 1944, 6th Army Group under Devers advanced quickly through southern France, took Strasbourg, and reached the Rhine earlier than many officers in Allied High Command had expected. In parts of his sector, reconnaissance patrols found sections of the Siegfried Line temporarily unmanned, and his engineers and logistics staff judged that a crossing in late November or early December was technically possible. At the Hotel Heritage in Vittel, Devers pressed that case, while Eisenhower, supported by Bradley, refused permission and kept to the broad front plan and to the priority of clearing German forces west of the Rhine. A decision that official United States Army historians later described as a dubious choice that is hard to explain in hindsight. German planning for the Ardennes offensive depended on concentrating fuel and formations, especially armored units, and a major Allied crossing in the south at that time would almost certainly have forced German commanders to react, probably by drawing on some of the same reserves they were assembling for the Ardennes. But how far that would have changed the scale or timing of the Bulge remains a point of serious debate rather than a settled conclusion. Devers' engineer, Garrison Davidson, along with several other senior officers, later wrote that if Devers had been allowed to cross, the Battle of the Bulge, as it actually unfolded, might never have taken place. and that tens of thousands of casualties might have been avoided, and those views represent their professional judgment, set down in writing, rather than stories invented long after the event. Taken together, this does not point to a single decision that guaranteed or cancelled a battle. It points instead to what most historians now call a missed opportunity. In late 1944, Devers was one of the few Allied commanders whose front was still moving quickly, whose supply situation was improving, and whose opponents opposite him had been thinned. And for a short period, those conditions came together along the Upper Rhine. Eisenhower did not authorize the attempt, in part because he judged that a large effort in the south carried too much risk, and in part because his main political and strategic commitments were directed toward the Ruhr and the northern axis of advance. And while that choice did not create the Ardennes offensive by itself, it did, as later analysts have argued, leave German leaders with more room to concentrate for it. In that sense, Jacob Devers comes across as something more complicated than either a great neglected genius, or simply a victim of an inner circle. He stands as an example of a different, technically plausible exploitation of success on the Allied southern flank that was considered and then set aside. If you go today to the west bank of the Rhine near Strasbourg, it is not obvious that in November 1944, parts of the far side were only lightly held. And if you travel north and west into the Ardennes, the cemeteries and memorials still mark where the winter offensive fell on the American line. Those places are linked by the decisions made that winter. Whether Devers' failure to win his argument at Vittel almost stopped. The Battle of the Bulge is something historians are likely to go on discussing, but it is clear that for a brief time, one American general had a credible chance to cross the Rhine earlier than expected, and that the decision not to support that move was one of several choices that helped shape how the war in the West played out.